Well, Nathan Worcester, welcome to the NatCon Australia podcast.
Thanks for having me, Dan.
Now, you are a reporter for the Epoch Times based in Washington, D.C. There's a lot going on in that town at the moment. Can you give people a sense of the mood in Congress and in Washington, D.C. at this time generally?
Well, I think it depends on if you're talking to Democrats or Republicans. There was, I would say, a more exultant mood a few months ago. Obviously, the election of Trump, the fact that the Senate ended up gaining a 53 Republican majority, the fact that the House didn't fall into the hands of Democrats. For Republicans, that was a huge win. I think that Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, he deserves more credit than some people give him for keeping his caucus together. But for the most part, he has been getting a lot of criticism on the side of the Democrats. Of course, there has been persistent gloom. They're locked out of power. They have been able to have a role in some of the protests that we've seen, some of the kind of resistance 2.0 stuff that has emerged in and around DC. I mean, a few months ago, as reporting on these various protests that were taking place outside of the Department of Labor, the Treasury Department, other departments targeted by Doge. On the other hand, you've seen over the past few weeks Musk's departure from the government, the squabble that he had with Trump, although he seems to be trying to mend fences there, and Doge seeming like less of an achievement than it may have a few months back. And of course, right now you're having the Israel-Iran conflict, the fact that the United States might or might not become more involved, and yeah, it's definitely a period of, I would say, obvious tension, obvious discontent. And for Republicans themselves, they're attempting to get this one big, beautiful bill act through budget reconciliation. And just for context, budget reconciliation means that in the Senate, they don't need 60 votes, and they're never going to get 60 votes. They only need the 50 plus one. But there's a certain amount of, I don't want to say pessimism, but gloom or skepticism about the notion of getting it done by July 4th, which is the deadline that they've set. I know I just said a whole lot, so please feel free to tell me if I should go back.
There is a lot going on. I mean, the number one issue as we record is the Iran issue. Walking around Washington, D.C. and the halls of Congress, do you sort of hear is there scurrying of activity? Are there war drums, sounding out across the Potomac? Are there people, are there any, because apart from the press and some high profile podcasts and the like the one with Tucker Carlson, that's, and, obviously posts on X and stuff, it's hard to get a proper sense about whether Washington D.C. is truly in kind of war mode, and this is that the trains are leaving the station, and there's not much that can be done to stop it.
Well, I think just again, an important piece of context. This isn't going to come as much of a surprise to people who pay attention to American politics, but the Senate on the Republican side is a lot less MAGA, a lot less responsive to populist energy than the House. That's partly because the Senate, you can serve for 7 years rather than 2. You're less electorally vulnerable. You're less susceptible, I would say, to the will of the people. And on the Republican side, there's a reason that you had these big splits in like the votes for funding on Ukraine, where you would see a lot of House Republicans voicing opposition, whereas in the Senate, you tend to have more hawkish voices, people like Tom Cotton, Ted Cruz, as we saw in that interview with Tucker. Although, in fairness to him, he did, as he pointed out, stop supporting Ukraine aid when it became clear in his view that that was not effective. What I'd say is, like, in general, being on the Hill this past week, I heard Mark Wayne Mullen, guy from Oklahoma, various other senators on the Republican side, and then of course John Fetterman expressing strong support for, at the very least, what Israel is doing, the strikes on Iran, and leaving open the possibility of further U.S. involvement. I think on the Republican side, there is a lot of attempting to track whatever is happening from the Trump administration, attempting to kind of triangulate around that. Democrats have been generally more critical. Interesting thing to note is that Chuck Schumer, the minority leader, and Mark Warner, who's the senior Democrat on the Intel committee, so very important positions, very important senior people, they co-signed a statement essentially saying that there needs to be some congressional scrutiny, some attempt at the very least, to, as they put it, avoid sleepwalking into a third war in as many decades, which is kind of elides the truth a little bit because, hey, there was also Libya, there was also the U.S.'s involvement in Syria. We could go down the list of things aside from Afghanistan and Iraq. But to get it back to what you initially asked, are there war drums beating? Yes, but I wouldn't say that we're necessarily at like the war chant phase or whatever the next step would be from that.
Yeah. So I listened to that interview that Tucker did with Ted Cruz, and I thought it was quite interesting. I- my take, and I'd be interested in your assessment, is that you know he some of these people haven't actually changed that much from the Reagan era in their mindset, but they recognize that they need to bend a knee to some of these new political realities and the success of Trump, and they try and um, rebadge their own positions as America First or as MAGA. What percentage do you think of the Republican representatives in Congress? I know it's a big group. Uh, a bona fide sort of on board with the Make America First, Make America Great Again
Yeah, I mean,
agenda that Trump sort of.
well, that's a very good question because Make America Great Again versus America First, not to
Mm,
split hairs here, but those can be different things. You have
mm,
MTG, for example, Marjorie Taylor Greene, would call herself an America Firster, also a clear Trump ally in the House, but someone who is fairly outspoken about the notion of expanding U.S. involvement. And now, just in the past few hours, she has been able to post, oh, this is great that Trump has now, as of just an hour or so ago, very, very recently, said that there's going to be a 2-week period during which the U.S. decides what it's going to do. You have people like Josh Hawley, for example, someone who writes for Compact Magazine in a very interesting ideological space where, on the one hand, he's one of the few Republicans who has been very vocal on the notion of what amount to cuts to Medicaid, or at the very least, right now, not to get too much into the weeds, but a change in the provider tax. That mean that states have a harder time having the federal government hold up part of the Medicaid costs that are now under federal, responsibility with the expansion under Obamacare. So Hawley is a bit of a populist on that. On the other hand, he has been fairly vocal in supporting this Israel-Iran conflict on Israel's side. You asked me for a percentage, and to what extent they're following Trump's agenda. And again, not to get into semantics and hair splitting, but
mm,
I do think that one of the there people can overstate the extent to which Trumpism and Reaganism are part of some seamless garment because they aren't in many ways. But on the other hand, Reagan, for example, he did, under some circumstances, support a more protectionist stance than people give him credit for. Trump, in his emphasis on the peace through strength doctrine, there is a legitimate side to the um, Trumpian coalition that would be more aligned with, for example, a Mark Levin or with a Ted Cruz. But of course,
mm,
Levin famously supported Cruz in 2016. Cruz was not a fan of Trump when he was the, poster child for the establishment in that year, although a more
mm,
conservative poster child than a Mitt Romney 4 years previously. So what we've seen, and this is pretty obvious in social media, and I think you see it in the halls of Congress in the way that this is perceived, is key elements of the coalition, at least in the past few days, seem to have become a bit alienated from it and are still, from what I can ascertain, hoping that what we're looking at is more of an attempt that will lead to a success in forcing Iran to the negotiating table. Of course, it is legitimate to wonder at this stage, after what appears to have just been an elaborate disinformation campaign by the Trump administration, in part, uh, how legitimate they would see an attempt to negotiate on those terms. But this is definitely like very tactically, strategically consistent with the Trump deal making approach, where there is always, it seems, some degree of bluster that under other circumstances was somebody who was not seen as capable of, under some conditions, pulling the trigger on using the world's largest and most powerful military. it might just seem like bluster. And in fact, you had like the Democrats going with this taco Trump always chickens out
Mm.
motto, which yeah, to be fair, in the context of tariff negotiations, he has moved back more than he's moved forward since that Liberation Day announcement a few months back. But Trump has this clear capacity to actually negotiate on these hardball terms. We're just going to have to see, okay, is this actually going to amount to what I think a lot of people in the core America First and much of the core MAGA coalition fear, which is an Iraq or Afghanistan style long term war, even possibly regime change? Or are we looking at just a long term effective attempt to bluff, to really put an end to, uranium enrichment above 60%, all of those concerns that Trump, Vance, the White House have articulated. And that's a moving target. It's hard for me to say what we're looking at. And maybe that's to the credit of the White House that Trump remains this unpredictable.
It is a strategic asset in a way to be unpredictable because and have a reputation for not laying out your plans in detail in advance, which actually Trump in his campaign sort of criticized Bush for doing that, like telegraphing what we're going to do, what the Americans going to do, sort of weeks in advance. So can sort of see how that works, but it does also have its downsides because no one knows no one can plan
Yep.
for it all too. But so if he pulls it off, great. It's a very high wire type of act. I always think with the MAGA thing, I always give much more credit to those people that were on board in 2015, well before it became demonstrably politically popular. That there was this new agenda that the public were behind. And I also give credit to people who came from the Democrat side or sort of from a non-Republican or center-right background, and then came on board. People like Tulsi Gabbard. You mentioned just before we got online that Steve Bannon had, I think, lunch or dinner with Donald Trump in the last 24 hours. He was certainly one of the original MAGA guys. What do you make of that? And what have you heard that's come out of that meeting?
Well, it's at least as a sequence of events, and this is something that Kurt Mills of the American Conservative drew attention to. It's very striking that this 2 week announcement that comes after the meeting with Bannon, it comes at a time when you see, on the one hand, Trump having very publicly now said he disagrees with Tulsi's assessment from a few months ago, which he testified about before Congress, that Iran was not moving in a meaningful direction towards nuclear weapons, at least ones that could be, delivered, ones that could be a meaningful threat.
I
So,
looked at it up. Is it right? Because she said she continues to assess that Iran is not building a nuclear weapon, and the Supreme Ayatollah Al Khamenei has not authorized the nuclear weapons program he suspended in 2003. So that was in March 27, and then later on, she sort of JD Vance made a post, and she said Gabbard has said that even the intelligence community assessed that Iran hasn't reinvigorated its program, but that she has recognized that Iran's stockpiles of enriched uranium have reached their highest levels. I think it's just all important because people kind of throw these things, I know you don't, but I mean, on the internet and the rest of it, and even in the irresponsible reporting about precisely what was sent when. So the issue is that they have, at least according to one presumes, additional intelligence gathering efforts, enriched uranium, but not, I guess, started to produce bombs with uranium in it. Is that sort of
that that was the issue, the big trigger, and this was after the 60-day window that Trump actually laid out explicitly. Was the IAEA, the UN watchdog, determining that at Fordow were in violation of that restriction on 60% enrichment. So yeah, but I mean, he did. This is, I don't think, irresponsible reporting. When he was asked by a reporter if he disagreed with Tulsi, I believe it was either earlier today or yesterday, he said, well, I know what I know, and perhaps it's based on additional intelligence gathering. Perhaps Daniel Radcliffe, the CIA director, maybe others have more information or a different perspective. One big player has been General Kurilla, nicknamed the Gorilla. He's the CENTCOM general who I'm guessing you read is approaching the end of his tenure and has had, at least over the past few days, a significant amount of influence as more assets move towards CENTCOM. It's fair to say that, for example, the carrier group, the USS Nimitz that has moved from the Pacific now towards Iran, that's not the only thing, not the only carrier, U.S. or UK, as it happens in the Indo-Pacific. It's not like everything is being redirected, but that is happening. That is one factor among many as this situation evolves as it does.
Yeah, I was saying to a mate the other day, this whole thing, it's it's moving so quickly. For the part of the reason Trump got elected was his very critical views on the Iraq wars. Um, and during that time, I remember it vividly. We had Hans Blix, cruising in there and doing additional inspections. We had multiple UN resolutions, and we had Colin Powell and other people giving their presentations. Where in this case, where it seems like this story really started to ramp up. I mean, what, in the last 2 weeks, more or less, and we just seem to be going potentially into a bigger country with a bigger task, with far less deliberation than was even the case with Iraq. And we didn't, I mean, in my view, didn't get that at all right. So, um, I, what's your assessment? I guess Steve Bannon or some of those guys is delivering this message fairly directly, that have a, we can't do this, can't be Iraq Mark 2 or 3 or 4, whatever the number is, right?
Yeah, because there have been plenty of semi-Iraq since then, as I
Yeah.
pointed out, Libya, and you could argue Syria, where,
Yeah, yeah.
again, we just have to take it somewhat on faith that
Mm.
the current situation, the current leadership is better than what pre-existed it. We're going to see exactly what's happening with Alawites, Christians, other minorities there. There's troubling news coming out. On the other hand, just to steelman the people who are concerned about Iran, I mean, there is significant persecution of Christians, especially those outside of the state-accepted Christian groups in that country. That's not a reason to push a button and say, "Hey, we need to do regime change." But, you do look at that. You look at, in fairness, I think there is genuine dissent among a lot of Iranians in relation to the Ayatollahs, in relation to the existing regime. That does not necessarily mean that you would want to have the sort of developments that we saw in Iraq and Afghanistan, or any sort of situation where it would appear that there is some leader who's able to come in after the United States. Let's use the term liberates, to be polite, after the United States makes its presence felt and upends the leadership, and then you have this person or party or whatever apparently not being the favorite of the people in practice, a gap opening up. The Shah's son has been very public in voicing his concerns with the regime there. He actually is based here in the DC area. Interestingly enough, is
Yeah.
he the? Would it be good to uh, uh, you know attempt a regime change? And I'm choosing my words carefully here because I think that again, it's fair to say that from the Israeli side, the regime change objective, such as it exists, is not a primary objective. It's the sort of thing that they would tell you this is going to be contingent on what the people in Iran think, what they say, what they do. But it does seem like you have things moving in a very Iraq-like fashion, and to further steelman the case for, say, airstrikes aimed at Fordow, that could, in theory, if it doesn't develop further, be not necessarily operationally, and I'm not an expert on the opening phases of the Afghan war, our invasion, and what happened there, but maybe a little more similar to that than to Iraq. But of course, we had Afghanistan and Iraq transform into nation building exercises. I mean, perhaps this is something that I've heard from Trump supporters who, will speak very bluntly about this. Like perhaps because Trump, under I think any fair definition, is not a neoconservative in the proper sense, in the sense of person who would like say Max Boot, who has even, I believe, said that he's concerned about lack of resources going to Ukraine because they're going to other conflicts, because they might be going to Gaza or to similar such American, American either direct military involvement or American allies. There's a sincerity in the nation building perspective from dyed in the wool neocons that Trump has never had, from what I can tell. So if we see at the end of this, okay, there is some attempts to just strike or not stop strikes on Fordow on other nuclear sites, and then no subsequent nation building adventure, that would be different, but I do my mind does turn to the Republican senators, to, uh, for that matter, a lot of the Democrats, many of whom were, not necessarily opposed to that nation building at the time that it was taking place, or who were proteges of people who were in support of that nation building, and I do wonder, are we gonna see maybe a similar gap open up over, a multiple month, multiple year stretch of time? Yeah, it's, as you said, there's so much moving, there's so much happening. At a certain level, to just reiterate the point, Donald Trump's, however hawkish he may be in a given situation, lack of a neoconservative instinct from the perspective of someone hoping to avoid an Iraq or Afghanistan might be his saving grace.
Yeah, I mean, JD Vance has that line where he says, we we want a military which is strong, that we when we hit hard, but we're not going to involve ourselves in every single conflict on the planet because it's most of the time, often it's none of our business. I mean, that type of attitude is new and different, or at least a reassessment of where we were in 2003. But the I just trying to get my head around this because so much turns on the intelligence community's assessment about the risk of this nuclear weapons program in Iran. And, there's been things online where you've seen Benjamin Netanyahu over the last 20 years or more say that Iran is, weeks or months or, away from producing a bomb. And I understand why they're concerned. You don't want to have, this a regime that at least explicitly says they want to, wipe you off the face of the map and then develop a nuclear bomb. So I fully got that assessment. It's just that how do you as a reporter in DC, how do you kind of ask those questions of this, the intelligence community? How do you get answers out of them?
Well, I think it is fair to say that a lot of reporting is heavily influenced by what is selectively leaked from people in the intelligence community. I think we saw that pattern pretty consistently throughout the first Trump term, generally in the direction of discrediting the Trump presidency. I think to a large extent it's going to depend on your sourcing, who you know, who you trust. I am definitely not not always averse to, say, an unsourced claim attributed to the intelligence community, which you'll see in a fair number of stories in large, very mainstream publications. But I would tend to just anytime I see that kind of wonder, okay, what is the most plausible source for this? What objectives might they have in mind in disseminating this specific narrative? Again, you drew the comparison between what we saw with the rollout of what was claimed to be credible intelligence prior to the invasion of Iraq versus this, where things are moving so quickly. There's no new DNI assessment. There's nothing beyond the IAEA findings, and then just the sort of like, let's trust that there is new intelligence that exists out there. So that in a sense it means that probably the conventional playbook for um, for managing narratives around military conflicts, the playbook that you see from both the media and from the intelligence community, it's not quite the same as it would normally be, and yet at the same time, I mean, it's difficult to you find yourself wondering, for example, and I'm just going to lay out this is something that Seymour Hersh has reported. I'm not able to verify this, but his recent claims about the possibility of the U.S. leading heavy strikes over the weekend, targeting Fordow with, just for context, those bunker buster bombs, which would be necessary to get down to the heavily fortified Fordow facility. Um, yeah, I find myself wondering who is the sourcing for that. Are they fully reliable? Is this because it's some journalists have the ability through their personal cachet and their record to influence policymaking. So, whomever might have been the source, perhaps they're either concerned about this happening or, and again, I want to just emphasize that I'm speculating, but, what I guess one would ask oneself, what is the value of telegraphing this reported possible strike beforehand? Would this be perhaps aimed at, again, if we're looking at an attempt from the Trump administration to really strike fear into the hearts of the Iranians prior to further negotiations, which is possibly what we're seeing. Again, things are moving so fast that I want to be very cautious in what I say. But if that's what's happening, yeah, maybe we're seeing something telegraphed to that end. Um, yeah, that's it's always a bit of a challenge when you're dealing with things that are deliberately cloaked in a bit of, I would say, in general, kind of deliberate cultivation of mystique. I think that's just part of the notion of, hey, I'm relying on people who are from a three-letter agency, and my editor can trust me, but and you can trust me based upon my track record, but yeah, it's
Yeah.
become, from what I can determine, and I'm not that old, but I don't recall even in the Bush era as quite as much, unsourced intel community sourcing for large stories.
Yeah, there's this i- it's frustrating, right? Because there's a necessary reason why national security intelligence needs to be kept secret. You can't disclose everything you know. Um, but at the same time, when there are such consequential decisions being made on the basis of what the intelligence is determining, and it isn't laid out in full, and like you said, there's there's no doubt there are that the intelligence community or people within it do brief mainstream publications like the Washington Post when they want something to be put out there, but you never get to interrogate that or the person or the source of it properly. So it has in the past led to faulty decision making, that type of process, right? So um, and Tulsi Gabbard was meant to at least be a refresh on that, to provide by putting someone in place who was openly critical of the intelligence community. That was meant to sort of provide, I suppose, additional confidence that the new assessments that are made and the operations that they conducted would have a new type of integrity to them, or would be properly scrutinized. She seems to have been sidelined a bit, though, right? Is that your assessment of what's occurred in the last couple of weeks?
Well, that's something I have not been closely tracking, but from the reporting on her, I believe, non-participation in those Camp David talks, just from, as I previously mentioned, President Trump saying that he disagreed with that March testimony, that assessment, which I think is worth emphasizing is more or less consistent with the intel community's assessments for decades in the past. Which again, if you're someone who is steel manning the a more pro-intervention case, you would say, well, that might reflect somehow captured by the intelligence community if they're undervaluing the significance of new information about the extent of the Iranian nuclear non-civil nuclear program. Uh, I I guess I would say we're still at a stage where, in much the same way, you have Cash Patel and Dan Bongino in the FBI, facing some scrutiny, some tough questions from a lot of MAGA voters who were hoping for more answers, hoping for more disclosures related to everything from the assassination of JFK to the exact details of Jeffrey Epstein's you know activities. I suppose that and at the same time, I think it's fair also to say that we're still in early days in the administration, and as much as I think some of these issues are very sexy, like Jeffrey Epstein, what was happening there, JFK. They also have a mandate to, in the case of the FBI, for example, just be the law enforcement agency of the land at the federal level, which would
Mhm.
mean things like striking at the cartel operations in the United States, would mean things like trying to address the high homicide rates in many American cities. So if that's where the resources are going to, if there's actual, uh, delivered successes there over the next few months and years, that might be an appropriate time to really for people who are now critical to fully assess their perspective. I'm thinking now of do you remember the episode of The Simpsons where the X Files characters appear, and I think it's Fox Mulder is told that there's a shipment of drugs coming into New Jersey, and he says something like, "Well, I think that's hardly a matter that the FBI should concern itself with." The joke being, the X Files is this fictional universe where they're exploring, monsters, and they're exploring space aliens, all this sort of stuff. But the actual core mission of the FBI, you know, and this doesn't. I think that in looking at the broader, internationally focused intelligence efforts, the concern about lack of meaningful change or some sort of lurch back in time towards a more, if not neoconservative, then liberal internationalist, whatever particular ideological label roughly corresponds to more hawkish in relation to the brewing conflicts in the world. If that's what we're seeing, then and what we're seeing now also from the MAGA base is an attempt to hit the brakes, and that is to the good of the country. If all those things hold true, then yeah, I mean, it's fair to say that just looking right now at the new 2 week deadline, which, in fairness, Trump is famous for setting those 2 week deadlines, and it's again hard to know if that's what that's going to amount to in terms of Muscat negotiations between Iran and the United States. But I would say that when you're trying to assess the overall state of what's going on in uh, Washington D.C. in the world that I wouldn't say I have been totally insinuated into because I'm still relatively new myself, but the one where the Trump administration in many respects does, beyond these current hot button issues, that does mark a significant change. Um, we will have to wait and see. And I would just like to, highlight somewhat apart from but related to what we're seeing in the Middle East, what the State Department is doing. If you're someone in the NatCon sphere, you may have heard of and recognized some of the names now at State. Michael Anton on the policy side, Darren Beatty. You have a fair number of people who I think, as far as the objectives of national conservatism go, appear to be, at least assuming that there's a relative degree of consistency in terms of how then the National Security Council or um, other bodies operate, appear to be operating in more of that clearly MAGA aligned set of interests.
Yeah, look, I don't think this is a new thing, but the difference between the Trump Mark One and Trump, this time around, is that you've got a whole bunch of people who've thought through in much more detail the agenda and are now been put in positions in the government who can then execute at a detailed level, because rather than just relying on the guy in the White House tweeting his thoughts or pushing executive orders of things through, it's much more substantial, the kind of the new agenda. One of the things that got knocked off the front page but was dominating news in the United States was the Los Angeles crackdown on illegal immigrants, and that has been very central to the MAGA agenda, immigration. Where is that now? I mean, or is that has that died down a bit, or have you got a sense of where things are at, or they're just continuing, except they're not generating the headlines they were because of the Iran thing?
Yeah, I think that the extent of actual demonstrations, from what I know, and I have been on the ground in Los Angeles, to be clear, I,
Mm.
I think you're probably still seeing periodic demonstrations, but nothing on par with what we were seeing very
Mm.
recently. And you, of course, had the very dramatic confrontation between, I believe it was Secret Service and California Senator Alex Padilla, who, it must be emphasized, was apparently not wearing the sort of pin that when you want to be identified as a lawmaker, and as someone who operates in the Capitol, I'm now very well aware of the badging systems and all the different security measures that everybody who works in this world is aware of. He was not wearing that, and so from the side of the Democrats, this is a photo op. I think this is the sort of thing that on MSNBC, on some of those networks and some of those audiences, there was a story that played well, and on the Republican side, you had, in addition to the crackdown and just what appears to be confrontation, where much of the polling I've seen would indicate that Americans, broadly speaking, are sympathetic to what ICE is doing, or at least sympathetic, much more so than a few years past, to the
Mm,
notion of addressing the scale of mass immigration, especially illegal immigration into the United
mm,
States. You have, I think, not to sound too cynical, but you have photo ops for both sides, and not much of a serious disruption to what ICE has been doing, what we've seen, and again, to just pause and kind of step away from the way that the headlines frame this issue. My understanding is that the initial actions by law enforcement were not immigration raids as such. This was targeting of cartel networks in Los Angeles and the Los Angeles area, which, it gets to a side of the issue that, if you're, for example, like one of my colleagues, if you're in California reporting on the border issues, one of the main things, one of the main consequences of the more open border that we've seen in recent years is human trafficking. And to 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 return to a theme, when people talk about human trafficking, I think the sort of alleged or whatever human trafficking involving very elite people, that's a lot sexier. That sounds a lot more interesting than just people basically bringing young women over the border as prostitutes, and
mm.
that happening in a very large scale way orchestrated by cartels. That's somehow a little bit dingier and more mundane, but that is a real and significant issue that I would imagine most Americans are not glad to see, not glad to endorse.
It should be about bipartisan, you would think, that type of, cracking down on, that type of nefarious behavior. I get a sense, again, from a distance, that there is reluctance amongst some parts of the Republican base, agricultural and other sectors, to crack down in the way that true MAGA supporters would have expected.
And
And
and yet we
and
just got a bad case of whiplash on that, didn't we? Because we had what appeared to
yeah.
be a fairly strong signal that, hey, the restaurant industry, the agricultural industry, they're gonna get a break, and then the president reverses that. So we were speaking a little bit about Trump's unpredictability. That's part of what we're looking at. Not to overrate the importance of social media or the kind of e-right, but it is interesting to see
Mm,
when people strongly, vociferously, and hopefully in an articulate and funny, when it's appropriate way, when they object to stuff like this
mm,
online, it does seem to track actual responses. I mean, it's easy, as I was saying just a few minutes ago, to look at, Bannon meeting with Trump, and you can come away with the impression that, yes, it was this one definitive meeting that
mm,
changed things. On the other hand, you have, um, from what I can personally tell and from what I've seen reported, I think a lot of the kind of Gen Z and younger millennial people who are staffing the Trump administration, that were the sort of people who would make up more of the like America First, MAGA hardcore, and a lot of these policy issues. I don't think that, with a few exceptions, there's all that much enthusiasm about the prospect of, if it materializes, a repeat of something like Iraq or Afghanistan. And you have a lot of those people, or people aligned with them, taking to social media, making their objections known. You look at many posts on Twitter that are generally aligned with intervention, or generally aligned with serious attempt at airstrikes, or perhaps more. And the comment section does seem to reveal a discrepancy between that and what I take to be the MAGA or America First base, what they seem to actually want. And so it's not that hard to imagine. Yeah, this could translate to um, people in the White House, or people in positions where they can actually um, amplify that influence being able to do so. That
Mm,
that's the interesting part of both, populism as a broader phenomenon, and Trump as a leader. Trump as the kind of tribune, in a sense, of that populist energy. Is yes, when you have the crowd roaring from the stadium that they're objecting, uh, that might be able to make a difference. That might actually be heard.
mm. There's been plenty of cases, haven't there, where people have posted. I mean, famously, the one that comes to mind is the Springfield, Ohio,
Yes, the Haitians.
became a massive issue, mentioned the presidential debate, but it was just a post. I mean, this stuff does bubble up and is seized on in a way that would never have happened in the past, in a sense. Um, the other issue, again, is trade, and it's sort of taken a back seat to everything, but it is important to Australia and other parts of the world, and does cause consternation. Again, do you think that there and some of these trade agreements do require congressional to make them change on a permanent basis would require congressional approval, right? The executive decisions that Trump's made on particular trade agreements are always potentially subject to challenge, and certainly subject to change if there's a new person in the White House. So do you think they've been convinced that someone like a Ted Cruz, that their assumptions about trade policy need to be fundamentally rethought? Or do you think it's like, and this is the case in Australia, they'll make an exception for China, and they'll, the trade system works fine. It's just Xi Jinping and China have, wrecked it, and we just need to take tough action on those guys. And so they don't truly change. They just sort of shoehorn their own existing ideology and into the new sort of MAGA agenda, but basically don't change very much when it comes to anything else, apart from, I don't know, Russia and China and a few other countries. So long-winded question, but I think you get what I'm saying, right?
I do. Yeah, oh, that's a very good question, and one where, again, I think you have clashing factions that have different conceptions of what the relationship should be between the United States and other countries, whether or not, if you want to reindustrialize the United States, tariffs are the main lever, or it's fair to say pretty much everybody in the coalition is in favor of cheaper energy. You might have people like, I don't want to name the person, but someone who is in Trump one who I've spoken to, who argues that no, what you'd want is evaluated tax combined with very cheap energy if you want to reindustrialize. But also, you would need a lot of cheap labor, and the best way to get that would be to open the border more. So perhaps not the perspective that's going to win out. On the other hand, the more tariff maximalist perspective embodied by Peter Navarro, it's one that's being heard, and the fact that Navarro himself showed a great deal of personal loyalty to Trump by famously not testifying before what he and Steve Bannon both argued were improperly constituted committee, the select committee that then culminated in them serving prison time, federal prison time. I think that matters, but you do have people like, for example, Scott Bessent, Lutnick, Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, in the room, who are somewhat between those maybe poles that I just offered, of the more MAGA neoliberal perspective on the one hand, and then the tariff maximalist perspective. The way that I would try to make sense of it all, and to your specific question about whether we're just seeing kind of an Oz style, let's make an exception for China, but otherwise, free trade doth reign, is I was at the American Compass Gala a few weeks ago. This is a think tank, very, very populist economically. Okay, yes, yes. And
Yep.
so you actually had there Vice President J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio, Secretary of State, along with several other things. Among them, he's USAID leader, and he's the acting national security advisor. Big voice in the room. Both of them spoke, and they both pointed out that at the time, 5 years ago, when American Compass was established and they laid out this manifesto arguing for, on trade, among other issues, a more Trumpian, I suppose, more broadly populist, more, fair trade, I suppose, or more a perspective where it's not just because of national security that you would be concerned about the United States being able to produce certain things or have yawning trade imbalances. That it's actually something fundamental that ties into concern with the dignity of work for the sort of people who, generation ago would have been working in factories, 2 generations ago, maybe in many cases. But that ties into a broader ideological project. You had I was there and heard Rubio. He did touch on those issues. It's fair to say, hit on the national security side more so than
Mhm.
JD Vance. But assuming that the two men are the standard bearers of the party, I would say that in general, and then you also have a Josh Hawley, who I mentioned previously, another potential contender in 2028. I would say
Mm.
that it would seem as though the mainstream of MAGA, maybe not, and I'm going to stress this, maybe not at the level of, say, think tank intellectuals, the sort of people who, as John Cochrane, an economist from the Hoover Institute, told me, make up the deep state of conservative intelligentsia in the U.S. Who they tend to be more neoliberal or more concerned about the negative potential consequences of trade restrictions. Those people certainly do continue to have influence, in part because the conservatism in the U.S. It doesn't have a huge intellectual bench, more so on the MAGA side now than during the first administration for sure. But a lot of those people are also quite young. Um, but the actual, at least the people who are best positioned to lead it in the future, from what I can tell, do seem to be very much on board. And they will. I think that the national security concern, and the specific focus on China is a real part of it. But that's not the entire reason for caring about it.
It's very encouraging that the really bright youngish guys like Marco Rubio and JD Vance, who were not on board in 2015, have nevertheless sort of thought through the agenda and genuinely become convinced that it is the right approach. Um, so, so, but I just again get a sense that even in that interview that JD Vance did at that compact dinner, that they've seized the White House, they've put people in key positions in the administration, but at the congressional level, these people who have been there a long period of time, they are not fully. What I'm saying is that these people like J.D. Vance and Marco Rubio are more the exception than the rule when it comes to the Republican representatives in Congress. And on something like trade, you do need congressional approval if these agreements are going to be changed substantially going forward. And you still see on other issues, foreign policy. Has Lindsey Graham really changed that much at all? Have
I would
um,
say one thing you come to appreciate being in Congress as a reporter and just being in DC, and yeah, I mean, seeing the kind of the social world, seeing the way that the sausage gets made, and how people are able to be political survivors and be politically effective in the way that Lindsey Graham is, leaving aside ideology and either his evolution, or some would say opportunism. And again, I'm stressing, I'm not trying to take a stand either way myself, because I'm trying to look at this as analytically as I can. I think that when for example, you see someone like a Lindsey Graham come out of a meeting where there's this attempt by Rand Paul, who chairs a committee that, in the case of this one big beautiful bill, is charged with determining how much is going to be spent on the border wall. You have Rand Paul, a libertarian, someone who, in some ways, I think it would be fair to say a lot of MAGA people tend to align with the Rand Paul, despite the conflicts with Trump, or even with Thomas Massie for that matter, despite the fact that Trump has now pledged to primary him. But you see someone like Lindsey Graham, who can come out of that meeting after Rand Paul says, "Hey, we need to spend a lot less money on this border wall," and he can, as a person who knows how to get the sausage made, as someone who knows how to actually wield influence, say, "I'm going to be the voice of, hey, let's save a bit of money, but we're not going to compromise the Trump agenda." I think you look at that sort of thing, the way it adds up over time. It is not too surprising to me then that you have Trump endorsing him. I think that a Lindsey Graham is exactly the sort of person who, like it or not, gets things done to the extent that things actually do get done in the Senate, done in Washington.
Yeah, I look. I mean, I guess he's a good politician in one sense, right? And a lot of the stuff, the non-headline business of Washington, does require people that can know how to insert something in a bill to get something important done for someone, and it's not necessarily a world historical issue, but it is important.
Exactly.
It's necessary, and so you need that kind of ballast there of people who know how the machinery works properly. Hey, I was going to ask just a broader question. You're in Washington. I guess you're in the Washington D.C. press corps, right? What do you think that's going to look like in 10 years? Because there's already been signs that there are that White House at least have allowed more podcasters and alternative media sources in there. How will it change?
That's a great question, and I do think when it comes to the overall composition, there's been a trend of what I'd call more generously professionalization, but less generously credentialization. The sort of new mainstream journalists, they do tend to be people who come out of a place like Medill at Northwestern or the Columbia Journalism School with a master's degree. I want to be charitable here because I think there are a lot of people with that background who are very fine reporters. But yeah, they do tend to come with a particular ideological background or particular inclinations, and the world of sort of independent podcasters or people who really often have less conventional backgrounds, that no matter what, I think it's going to be making its influence felt in large part just because of the profit motive and the fact that you're seeing in the new media environment where it's not even new at this point, the challenges of the profitability of a lot of conventional media. There are organizations, there are outlets that are organized as nonprofits, and one of them's Notice News of the United States, alongside these well-known outlets like Fox, CBS, NBC, whatever. From what I can tell, the I think that there's a reason that you see, in general, a more conservative or sometimes libertarian, or just generally like non-mainstream liberal ideological composition from the new media people, and it's because of rightly or wrongly what is perceived as a fair amount of ideological conformity from the conventional outlets, and you do see attempts with some streamers, some figures like Hassan Piker, for example, or the whole BreadTube universe, an attempt to create or to foster a similar environment on the left. It doesn't seem to be as successful. Maybe a few years from now there will be something more organic there, and I do think that will depend on if we have a Trump administration that gets things done. If we then have JD Vance for a few years, maybe there will I think a lot of people on the left who would want to see themselves as the underdog and the outsider, you could create the conditions for people to have a more organic um, response and a more like organic network of those alternatives. But I, one important note I would say here is that as much as the podcasters, as much as the kind of new media people, a lot of them do bring in, a fresh perspective. A lot of them do bring in, uh, you know, media that people actually pay attention to and respond to in a way that makes it appropriate that they should have some degree of access, that they should have the ability to be heard. There can be issues there with professionalism. There can be issues there with being able to simply report a story and not just always have a take on it. There's a whole economy of take having in the alternative media space, not as much of fact gathering and just,
Yeah.
fact reporting, for better or for worse. And so, yeah, if I were someone evaluating what's it going to look like in a few years, um, I think it's going to depend, of course, a lot on who wins the next election and then subsequent elections. The very granular matters of access to the White House, and then maybe even access to Congress itself. Those could change based on that. But also, if there is um, more of a balance between the take having and the fact gathering from some of these alternative news sources, I think long run, that's how you are able to maybe for people who are ideologically opposed to you, you're never going to fully, or what they perceive of you, you're never going to fully be perceived as credible. But at the very least, that is maybe a longer range way to gain and maintain a foothold for people who are in the alternative media space and tend to be more MAGA aligned.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I mean, you need a variety of voices, don't you? And you need the professionalism of the, I don't know, Walter Mondale types, and but alongside that, the real cynical Mencons who are,
Yes.
federal government as well. And I just feel like we haven't had enough of Mencons in the Washington D.C.
Yes.
well, right,
Well,
over the last several years. So,
Yes, the return of Mencken, his ghost will rise from Baltimore and drift across the suburbs to DC. That would be quite a sight. But yeah,
ha-
I think that gosh, if I had to, I would hope that over time there's more. When I say more Menckens, I would also say like people who are acerbic, but who can also draw on the facts in the way he does. Because one thing about Mencken is that he was not a populist. He was certainly a very committed elitist, and
yes, well, yeah, very cynical about, well, realistic, I suppose, what of the popular will or the populace in general. But
yeah,
although,
yeah.
yeah,
There's a reason he and Lippmann were fairly aligned on that famous debate that Lippmann had with Dewey about the public and media consumption from the I think the 1920s.
I'll have to
Anyway,
look
go
at
ahead.
that. Hey,
Oh
I
yeah,
try and keep it to an hour, but I really enjoyed the discussion. I'll drop the details about your column from the Epoch Times and your X handle and the like. Do check out Nathan. He's very much in there in the belly of the beast, providing a good perspective on things. And the more we need more of that than ever, because a lot of the events that will unfold depend on what's going on in the Imperial capital. Great to speak, Nathan. I'll leave you to it.
absolutely, and glad to be able to have a remote visit at least to the antipodes. Perhaps I will actually find a reason to get out to Australia. There's bound to be some senator heading there or some congressman heading there at some point.
Yeah, well, we PM missed out on an interview, face to face with Donald Trump. So who knows? Maybe he'll come by and meet someone in the region at some point. I'll leave you to it, Nathan. Take it easy, man. Keep it up. Bye.
You too. Thanks, Dan.